In a second, you're going to watch me unbox this little monster after having bought it over 4 years ago and I'd completely forgotten what I'd ordered. I intended to make a video about it then after the Thermaltake Core V21, which is similar to this thing, but then I just forgot. After that, we'll jump into the performance and why you probably shouldn't buy it, if you could even get hold of it. It didn't age very well. I think when I bought it 4 years ago, it seemed like, I think it was about 4 years old then. Anyway, a big thanks for checking this video out, and if you can, throw a comment into the comment section and let me know what you're currently using your current system for, and what you plan to use your next system for. It helps with the algorithm, of course, and I'm going to use your comments to help guide what I make in the future. It might be a quirky version of what you might want to see, but it also might be really cool. Anyway, let's get cracking with this gem that I hadn't heard of before, and you probably hadn't either. Not really much point to this video because nobody's going to buy the thing. Probably even better off doing the fractal pops. Popsicle sticks. So, mind of a child, I still haven't seen what's in here. There appears to be some sort of... This is a glass panel of sorts. No idea what's going on here. So I thought, yeah, mind of a child, I'm just going to... We're going to see together what's behind the cover. 3, 2, 1... Okay, it is just, yeah, no, it is just, it's black glass, but it is blue plastic covering to both sides of the glass. That's right, not blue glass, actually not even tinted glass. We're 4 years back, and I think a little further from when the case was actually produced. So far back that it appears clear glass is coming back into fashion. But the lack of breathability is still out of fashion, thankfully. So, it's 4 big 4mm thick panels held in place by some fairly sizable knurled thumb screws. Removing these panels is a little fiddly thanks to the separate nylon washers that could do with being glued onto the thumb screws. On that note, replacing the panels was even more fiddly since whoever installed the panel ended up pinching the rubber grommets between the glass, and a lot of them. I'm sure they can be saved, but not amazing from the outset. I'm loving the brushed aluminium effect plastic though. Reminds me of the Fractal Design Define cases. Looks good enough and is way more robust than your typical cheap brushed aluminium used on, say, an affordable case. So yeah, rough around the edges, it's a look of a sort. Oh yeah, I don't know why I thought this was D-frame like in the style. It's nothing like a D-frame. That's how much time has passed. So yeah, large knurled thumb screws. And they're not just standard thumb screws, they look like sort of mild steel, galvanized mild steel. An aluminium handle up top with some very sort of standard screws holding those in, which looks a little bit odd. Odd is one way of putting it, really cool would be another. This aluminium flyover handle is bolted onto the plastic panel with nuts to the inner face. Just under the handle is something I find oddly satisfying, the front I/O. We've got a somewhat dated but reasonable two 2.0 Type A ports and a solitary single 3.0 Type A port with mic and headphone jacks, but the satisfying bits for me are the chunky power and reset buttons surrounding the drive and power LEDs. They have a nice recess that are large enough to make my thumbs feel wanted, and they're more akin to a switch rather than an ultra cheap stock push button that you tend to use on Arduino projects. They're just so good, it makes you want to push both at the same time. Yeah, large glass panels, 200mm fan up top, 200mm fan to the front. We'll go around the rear in a second. This thing looks like a monster. Jesus. Oh yeah, 200mm fans to the front and top. This thing actually has room for just a 240mm radiator or a couple of 120mm fans in the front in place of the 200mm fan. However, there's no room for interchangeability up top, which is a big disappointment. Actually, overall cooling configurations are lacking heavily with this case. There's no base support for fans or radiators, just blank steel, which is right for modding, I guess. And there just isn't any side fan or radiator support thanks to all the glass. You can squeeze an 80mm fan to the rear, and before I forget, this is an inverted motherboard layout, so we've got an upside down ATX board support which positions the PCI Express slots up top, and then we've got that 80mm fan position to the rear down below. Now, this is a fascinating approach to me since it's not one we see often, and it's something I'd only really consider doing for a compact case design, but this ain't no compact case. Anyway, fans. I mean, it's cheap, and oh god, I can see why it was only £60, but this is the kind of £60 I want to spend if this was what it was really cost, because this is at least fun, interesting, and different. Yes, they're cheap break-off panels at the back, but it's a £60 case and you've got 4 tempered glass panels, you've got a curved aluminium top panel, you've got 2 200mm fans which are probably awful. Probably awful. Rather insulting. I mean, that's not a terrible assumption since at the time I wasn't aware that these fans weren't just made out of the cheapest recycled sewer pipe, but they were also wired like they were made from the cheapest recycled sewer pipe available, if my knowledge of drainage thing to go by. For a start, they're LED fans, and I didn't know this then, but they're red LEDs only, which is the best colour if you've only got one option. Why aren't they controllable, I hear you ask? Well, remember when I said that this probably was designed a little further back than when I bought this 4 years ago. If we find the terminal to the LED strip, follow the wire back to the hub, back up, there was only 2 wires coming back, so back the other way we came, down through the hole, bunched up cables, and it's a Molex connector. It's a pass-through connector, so you can lump both of the fans into one power supply unit lead, but that's about as good as it gets. Now, while these do have the build quality of the 20-year-old kettle in your nearest Travelodge, they do have one saving grace, and that's that they're 200mm fans, so they're not built for speed. In my experience, and that's a perfectly adequate, if not unimpressive amount of experience, a basic 200mm case fan is about as good as a fairly decent 120mm case fan, emphasis on case fan there. They sort of get a bump in practical quality, and that's because they don't run very fast, so they don't tend to make that much noise. So little noise that they happen to produce the perfect amount of noise for my acoustic testing, which is 37.5 dBA at 40 centimeters from the front of the case at a 45-degree angle. That's total system output. So, at a fixed 800 RPM speed, it was suitable for that and the full speed testing. Anyway. Look at the gloss on that plastic. I mean, they look horrendous. But I mean, we'll see. 200s are quiet. But there's some interesting stuff going on here. I'm not sure if you can see it, but there's some sort of separation that I just don't even know. I just don't even know. Let me help you out there. In the rear compartment, there's a long plastic bracket with a truss-like construction. This is the drive and confusion storing bracket. For drives, it can take a couple of 3.5-inch drives to the side panel adjacent sections in sort of strange ways, and it can take up to a couple of 2.5-inch drives towards the back. Note that all of these drives are only held in place with a couple of screws, although they are marginally supported by the bracket itself, apart from the front 3.5-inch drive, which takes 3 screws, which explains the design afterthought of a hole cut out to the front. As for the confusion, there's a section of this bracket behind the front 3.5-inch drive that stores something. I mean, it can store whatever you want, I guess, but I can't figure out what it's intended for, or if it's intended for a particular component. The hole spacing isn't set for 2.5-inch or 3.5-inch drives, so maybe there's a chance it could take a 5.25-inch drive. But I haven't got one easily to hand to test that. It's in the attic, in a box. That's at least 5 minutes from being accessible, so we'll have to leave it there. Plus, access to all sides is limited, so it doesn't seem reasonable to expect it to work well, even if it did fit in, although you could get an adapter and convert it. Despite what it looks like, with the screws to the front and rear, I wasn't able to remove this bracket. I'm sure I'm doing something wrong, but the posts that slot into the front and back of the chassis seem to prevent it from being removed, since the chassis is very rigid and won't flex out of the way. I can imagine it's possible, but something I wasn't able to achieve. As for beneath the bracket, it's all for the power supply unit. Well, that is so long that you haven't installed the front 3.5-inch drive. But to be fair, even with that in place, this is still a big-ish case. So you've got 185mm of clearance from the drive to the back of the case, and there's only a 25mm overlap, so you're golden for clearance with the vast majority of cables, leaving most power supply units. There isn't any base support for the power supply unit though, which is a little unusual. Does it need it? Well, maybe big ones, but this one, no. It's only 140mm deep, but having something pressing against the drive can reduce the odd vibration noises that can occur from a bit of speed wobble action. To be fair, at this point I've covered most parts of the case. There are a few areas that need rounding off, and some design decisions and features that I think are interesting and I want to point out, which is why most of my videos end up being 30 minutes long. So let's cover those quickly and then we can get into the performance of this mini monster. First, the GPU installation, or graphics card installation. It was simple and clean. During the motherboard installation, I made sure to pop out the snap-off PCI Express covers, which wasn't actually necessary, but sometimes it is with snap-off covers, which for a case that did actually end up costing me £75 is a major offence to the installation ease category. It sounds like a build quality issue, sure, but that handles more broad stroke items and installation ease graphs. They drill down a lot more into details. It's been a while since I've built in an inverted case, so I ended up cable managing the PCI Express cables to run underneath the GPU. Well, it would be this way if it was a normal case, but since you end up seeing the underside, typically speaking, it looks a lot better to run the cables the other way round. Speaking of which, with so much space in the rear compartment, cable management was a breeze. There are a couple of cable management routes built into the drive bracket, which is handy, and there is an abundance of cable management holes in the motherboard tray to work with. As for the CPU cooler, I'd like to say I followed the guidance of the only specification source I could find, which was the eBias store page I happened to buy this case from. But I didn't and made a mistake entirely on my own, and then looked at the specification on the website. The problem was, I was running in automatic mode and installed the Scythe Mugen 5 cooler to my test system and proceeded to install it into the case. It's a fairly large cooler, it's a fairly large case. I put 2 and 2 together and came up with 5. I then proceeded to turn the case onto its head, which looks both cool and is as wrong as the cooler clearance on eBias store page. Long story short, the Scythe Mugen 5 is 155mm tall, and it definitely doesn't fit. It's not far off, but it's not right either. It happens that the eBias store page says 155mm tall coolers will fit, but after swapping the Scythe Mugen 5 test cooler with the Noctua NH-U9S test cooler and taking a measurement, it looks like there's only about 145mm of clearance, roughly 20mm more than the U9S, and this isn't surprising since many cases with rear 120mm fans only allow 160mm coolers, so yeah, a 120mm fan is a lot bigger than an 80mm fan that this can take, so it's not surprising it can only take a 145mm CPU cooler. Touching on the parts bag and manual, you get all the screws you need, some zip ties, and a slightly mangled PCI Express slot cover. With mighty thumbs comes mighty responsibility, which means they must be responsible for fixing this mess. As for the manual, there isn't one, which is where a lot of the guesswork for what this case is supposed to do comes from. Last on my list are the top and base panels themselves, which are identical. Flipping the case onto its side reveals not just the completely sealed chassis, but the foam feet where the panel would fix down to. The brushed aluminium effect plastic is also here, and the I/O section is present, which is just covered up with an adhesively fixed plastic strip. Even the holes for the handle are down here, so if you damage the top panel and you're in a pinch, you could in theory just swap them over with a little work. Anyway, that's all by the by. Now the build is done, it's time to get all the panels back on and test this sucker out. Normally I'd start off with the testing setups, the stock and then some optimized setups and that, but as I alluded to earlier, since the fans output the right amount of noise, we only need one setup, and that's the stock, which is a front 200mm intake and a stock top 200mm exhaust, both running at a fixed 800 RPM. Before testing, it's interesting to take a look at the design and make some assumptions on the outcome to see if they hold up. Despite the front being large, there's also a massive glass panel 20mm in front of it. It's not sealed all the way around, which is good. There are some large gaps at the corners and some slithers to the sides and base for access to fresh air. But the side panels aren't sealed against the chassis, so recycling is a distinct possibility. The top, on the other hand, has decent exhaust characteristics. Two 20mm thick, 200mm wide slots to both sides, which more than overmatch the intake area, which might help to eliminate the recycling effect. Let's find out. At full speed, which is the default state for the Helios, when compared to other Helios, I'm hoping that's the right way of pronouncing it, when compared to other cases with their fans also at full speed, the Helios performs poorly. Well, not just poorly, but on Priority 5 testing, the darker bars, it crashed 31.9% through the test on average. How do I know this? Well, the Excel file from Hardware Info was writing to ended 31.9% through the test, which was 10 minutes on average. That's the beauty of Hardware Info. It keeps going right to the bitter end. It's not alone though. The O11 Dynamic Mini just above also failed at 69%, nice, and also didn't have any fans, not so nice. Was the Helios at least relatively quiet? Actually yes, the quietest on the board were 36.5 dBA and the Helios was just above at 37.5 dBA, but that doesn't really matter when it's coughing up blood 31.9% through the race. How about the acoustically limited results? Well, thanks for asking. Since the case at stock was exactly on the 37.5 dBA mark regarding noise output, we're just comparing the last set of results to all those previous cases with their fans limited to meet that acoustic target. Of course, the Helios still failed, you can't put that cat back in the bag. Unfortunately, these results are comparatively worse to the previous set since the Lian Li O11 Dynamic Mini, that had no case fans now has fans, so this case doesn't have that privilege. I could have replaced the front fan with a couple of test fans, but there isn't enough room inside the case due to the graphics card, and outside of the case there's only roughly 43mm of clearance between the glass and the chassis, minus the fan, that's 18mm of clearance, about 5mm less than the already stock 200mm fan. Speaking of which, the fan cutout for this case is purely designed for a 200mm fan. Put a couple of 120mm fans in here and you're cutting off at best a third of their free area, in addition to the lacking intake clearance to the glass. Best you can do here is put an AIO in for the CPU mounted to the front and hope the radiator overdoes that or overcomes that, or try out an 80mm fan to the rear of the case, probably your cheapest, if not best option. So let's wrap this up. All in all, due to the test fails, which are calculated as a 1 by the spreadsheet, the Helios comes out with an average score for all testing of 2.1 out of 10. Build quality wise, welcome back to the ATX cases on the graphs, it scores just above the U110 from last video, which also had no filters, but that had horrid drive support. Note that not all zeros are actually zeros, some are not applicables or NAs that don't get picked up in the average score, which is what is carried forward for the final score, so it's not getting a terrible 5.5 out of 10 for build quality. Installation ease scoring is quite positive for the Helios, scoring just under 9 out of 10. Remember, these zeros aren't counted in the final average. This brings us up to a total score of just over 20 out of 40. In other words, 5.3 out of 10. So it gets an alright compared to the I wouldn't of the U110 and the pretty good of the H210i just above it. Price-wise, it's not exactly cheap by today's standards. This could be a 10-year-old design, or at least well on its way to. At £75, what I paid for it 4 years ago, which is roughly $92 today, we're in the crosshairs of the Lian Li O11 Dynamic Mini, a much higher scoring case. So, in my sorts of very arbitrary price versus score graph, the Contour Helios, that found out it was made, or at least sold by a company called Contour, is roughly speaking as good as the Fractal Design Torrent Compact, because the Torrent Compact costs 67% more, but is only 73% higher in score. So that 6% difference is working its magic when they're multiplied together. Anyway, I've had my fun. If you want to pick this thing up, good luck. I was hoping for a little more, to be honest. Like I said, I was half expecting, after 4 years forgetting what it was, something like the Inwin D-frame, but apparently £75 isn't enough for that. Who knew? If you have any suggestions, please do get in touch in the comments. Make it something special though, let's keep things interesting, quirky, and preferably cheap. Again, please let me know what you currently use, what you use your current system for, and what you plan to use the next system for too. I'll throw a few polls out in the coming weeks on YouTube, but I want to get a feel for what my audience, what the people watching my videos do, and maybe I can find something interesting in that department. Anyway, thanks for watching this one, and a big thanks to my patrons for helping to keep the lights on. And I will be making a update video soon. I'm a little all over the place at the moment. I'll, get you tuned in on that when I make that video, but I'm getting back to things slowly. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.